One of the most uncomfortable things about Star Citizen is that your entry point almost doesn't matter. You can be an early backer, a mid-cycle backer, someone who came in around persistence, someone who arrived for pyro, or someone who bought a starter pack during a free fly because the trailer made the whole thing look like the space game you had always wanted. The timing changes, but the pattern does not. Spend a few years around this project and you start to notice the same thing every generation of backers eventually notices. The game you joined for is not quite the game being talked about now. Citizens, my name's Beard of Oz, and today I'll be talking about Star Citizen as a moving target. Not just the game as it exists today, and not the old dream people still argue about, but the way the project keeps changing its own shape while asking each new group of players to believe that this time, the current version of the pitch is the real one. And that is why Squadron 42 matters so much. It is not just another product in the Star Citizen universe, it is the clearest test of whether CIG can take years of promises, technology delays, reworks and marketing and turn them into a finished experience. Because if Squadron 42 cannot prove that the machine can actually deliver, then it becomes much harder to believe the persistent universe is simply waiting for its moment. Alright, let's dive in. Every Star Citizen player has a version of the project they joined for. For some, it was the impossible simulation, a living universe where careers mattered, risk had weight, ships had long-term purpose, and player choice would shape the experience in ways that most games never even attempt. For others, it was a more recent pitch, a playable live service alpha finally getting its foundations together with persistence, server meshing, pyro, and Squadron 42 acting as stepping stones towards something more complete. Some people joined for a ship, some joined for a profession, some joined because they watched a CitizenCon presentation and thought, right, this is finally the point where it all starts coming together. And honestly, I understand that. Star Citizen is very good at making the future look close. It always has been. The problem is that after a few years, whatever version of the future brought you in usually starts to look different. Not always worse in every way, and not always through some dramatic betrayal, but different enough that you can feel the gap opening. The terms shift. The emphasis moves. The feature you thought was central becomes dependent on something else. The thing that was nearly ready becomes part of a larger chain. The old promise is not always cancelled. Sometimes it is simply reframed until it means less than it used to. And that is the part I think a lot of people eventually run into. It's not just that Star Citizen takes a long time, we all know that. It is that the project takes long enough for the version you backed to age out from underneath you. You do not need to have been here from the beginning to feel that. You only need to have been here long enough to remember what was being said when you arrived. The problem with Star Citizen is not simply that it changes. Any game in development changes, especially one this large and strange. The problem is that Star Citizen changes while continuing to use the emotional weight of earlier promises to sell the current one. It tells one group of backers to believe in the simulation, another to believe in the tech, another to believe in playability, another to believe in Squadron 42, and another to believe that the next patch cycle is finally the one where the shape becomes clear. This is why different groups of players can sound like they're complaining about different games. Older backers may feel that the deep simulation has been watered down. Mid-era backers may feel that the career systems and economy they waited on still exist mostly as promises. Newer players may feel they were sold a rough but maturing live game, only to discover that many of the foundations are still unstable, unfinished, or waiting on another dependency. All of those people can be right, because the project has been sold differently at different points in time. That does not mean every change is dishonest. It does mean that the longer you watch Star Citizen, the easier it becomes to see the pattern. The project keeps reintroducing itself without ever fully resolving the vision it introduced last time. And after a while, that wears people down. Not because they cannot handle change, but because the new direction is always presented as progress, while the older expectations are quietly treated like misunderstandings. You start to feel less like a backer of a consistent vision and more like someone being asked to keep updating their memory of what they supposedly agreed to. People often argue about Star Citizen as though there is one true version of the project that everyone agreed to, but there really isn't. There are layers. There is the early dream, the post-hangar dream, the persistence dream, the server meshing dream, the pyro dream, the squadron dream, and the current playability dream. Each one overlaps with the other, but none of them fully replaces the old one in the minds of players who backed during that era. This is why criticism around this game can get so messy. Someone who joined for the simulation is not having the same argument as someone who joined for live service. Someone waiting on a profession is not necessarily frustrated by the same thing as someone waiting on Squadron 42, but underneath all of that, the shared feeling is drift. The thing you signed up for keeps becoming a slightly different thing before it ever fully arrives. And the uncomfortable truth is that it only ever takes a few years to see that happen. This is the part that matters. You do not need to be a veteran from the earliest days. You just need enough time to watch one promise become a dependency, one headline feature become a stepping stone, one major system become a prerequisite for another major system, and one confident presentation become a piece of old context people would rather not discuss too directly. This is where Star Citizen starts to feel less like a game moving toward a fixed destination and more like a project constantly preparing to become itself, always almost there. Always waiting on the next stabilizing piece, server meshing, engineering, economy, armor, maelstrom, crafting, quantum, base building, whatever the current missing foundation happens to believe. And I have believed that before. I've defended that before. I've said, let them cook. But after enough years, you are allowed to ask whether anyone is still following the original recipe, or whether the recipe has been rewritten so many times that the meal is now something entirely different. For a long time, the explanation was always the tech. The servers could not handle it yet. Persistence needed to exist. The replication layer needed to work. Server meshing had to arrive. The invisible back-end machinery had to be built before the real game could finally step forward. And to be clear, some of that is true. Star Citizen is trying to do difficult things, and I do not want to pretend the technical side is simple just because I'm annoyed by the outcome. But once those hurdles start being cleared, or at least partially cleared, the question changes. If the game still feels scattered, if the systems still do not connect, if the universe still feels more like a collection of impressive parts than a coherent whole, then the issue is no longer just waiting on technology. It becomes a question of direction. What is Star Citizen actually becoming now, and how far is it from what people were told it would become when they joined? And this is where Squadron 42 comes in. For years, Squadron has been one of the great explanations. Don't worry, the resources are there. Don't worry, the tech is being built there. Don't worry, once Squadron is done, that work will benefit the persistent universe. It has been the place CIG could point to whenever the PU felt undercooked, unstable, or slower than people expected. That means Squadron 42 is carrying a lot more weight than a normal single-player game. It has to prove that CIG can finish something, not sell something, not announce something, not show a polished vertical slice. Finish something. It has to prove that years of work, delay, technology, performance capture, reworks, and changing priorities can still result in a complete, coherent game that feels worth the wait. If Squadron 42 lands well, it does not fix every concern about the persistent universe, but it gives CIG something it desperately needs. Proof of delivery. Proof that the machine can do more than maintain belief. Proof that the years of shifting language and delayed systems can still end in something solid. But if Squadron 42 arrives rough, hollow, outdated, or simply average, then the implications are much bigger than one disappointing campaign. It would raise a very hard question about the whole project. If this is the focused, authored, controlled experience, the one without the full chaos of the persistent universe wrapped around it, and even that cannot land properly, then why should people believe the far more complex online universe is simply waiting for its turn? That is why Squadron 42 feels like the final proof point. It will either show that Star Citizen still has a finished game at the center of the machine, or it will show that the machine has become better at preserving anticipation than producing closure. And if Squadron 42 is good, even if it lands cleanly and gives CIG a wave of positive attention, it still does not automatically solve the persistent universe. A single-player campaign can be bought, played, praised, and finished. That does not mean the player then wants to step into a live alpha full of insurance claims, server issues, pledge store baggage, and unfinished loops. And if there is still another buy-in between Squadron 42 and the PU, that gap matters. Enjoying a campaign does not guarantee someone wants to buy a starter package and begin a very different kind of relationship with the project. CIG may be hoping Squadron 42 becomes a doorway into Star Citizen, but it could just as easily become a separate product people respect without wanting to live inside the unfinished universe attached to it. Now, I'm not saying there is literally some marketing team hiding in a boardroom deciding which dream to sell next. What I am saying is that Star Citizen's public-facing identity often feels shaped around maintaining belief. Belief that the next patch changes everything. Belief that the next system unlocks the game. Belief that the next ship gives your favorite loop meaning. Belief that the version you joined for is still in there somewhere. That belief has value, real value. Every new trailer, every new sale, every new ship, and every roadmap adjacent promise keeps the project moving. And I understand why people respond to it. The ships are cool. The idea is powerful. The community wants the dream to be real. I want the dream to be real. But wanting something to be true does not make the pattern disappear. The pattern is that Star Citizen keeps asking people to trust the next version of itself before the last version has been fully delivered. And because each new wave of players arrives at a different point in that cycle, each wave eventually has its own moment of realization. It might take 2 years, it might take 3, it might take longer. But eventually you compare the project you joined for with the project being described now, and the difference becomes hard to ignore. At some point, the question stops being whether CIG can keep selling the dream. They clearly can. The question is whether the dream is still being built as a game first, or whether the game has become a place where each new version of the pitch can be kept alive just long enough for the next one to take over. So, where do I stand on Star Citizen now? Frustratingly, not somewhere simple. I do not hate it. If I hated it, this would be easy. I could uninstall, make one final video, and move on. But I do not hate it. I still love parts of it. I still think there is nothing else quite like this when it works. I still think the scale, the ship design, the atmosphere, the unscripted player moments, and the sheer ambition of the thing deserve respect. But love is not the same as trust, and right now I do not trust the direction of the project the way I once did. I do not trust that every new sale is in service of the game rather than the funding model. I do not trust that every change in language is just natural development. I do not trust that Squadron 42 will automatically justify the years of patience people have given this project. Because regardless of when you joined, the experience eventually becomes familiar. You backed one version of Star Citizen, you waited, you watched the project change, you adjusted your expectations, then you noticed the new version being sold with the same confidence as the old one. And eventually you have to ask whether you are still waiting for the game you pledged for, or whether you are now waiting for the project to explain what it has become instead. That is why Squadron 42 matters. It is the receipt. It is the audit. It is the moment where CIG either shows that underneath all the shifting language, delayed systems, and marketing cycles, there is still a finished game waiting to emerge, or it shows that the project has become better at selling possibility than delivering reality. And there you have it. My incredibly tired, still somewhat hopeful thoughts on Star Citizen, Squadron 42, and the strange reality that no matter when you joined, it only takes a few years to watch the project move away from what it was saying it would become. But what do you think? Have you felt that shift as well? Did you join for one version of Star Citizen and slowly realize the project being described now is not quite the same one? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed the video, or if it at least gave you something to think about while waiting for your next insurance claim, hit the like button to appease the algorithm gods. Subscribe if you'd like more Star Citizen content, ship reviews, questionable takes, and the occasional critique of CIG's design choices. As always, citizens, stay safe in the verse. Keep your expectations measured, and I'll catch you all next time.